We're joined by Vivien Azer, Managing Director and Senior Research Analyst at Cowen. Vivien, it's always great to see you. Welcome back to the show. The House passing safe banking. This has happened before, but never in this political environment. What's the likelihood that it will pass, and what would it mean to businesses if it does?
Sure. Thanks for having me and happy 420. So you're right. The Safe Banking Act passed in the 116th Congress. So this is not the first time that's happened, but it is the first time that Democrats have control of both the House and the Senate. I think, clearly ceremonial insofar it was the eve of 420. We do think, however, though, my colleague Jarrett Seaberg in the Washington Research Group, who tracks cannabis for us on the federal level from the policy standpoint, thinks that it's going to have a tough time in the Senate. He's not entirely convinced there's actually even appetite at the committee level for this version of safe banking because it doesn't include anything on social justice.
Interesting. If this were to pass and we were to see something like safe banking getting through, the Senate and ultimately passed into law, what would that mean for pot stocks? Which stocks would stand to benefit most from that?
Sure. I mean, all of the U.S. multi-state operators would certainly stand to benefit. The cost of capital is very high in cannabis today. Interest rates can range from 12 to 15%, and that's even for really good operators that have adjusted EBITDA margins in the mid 30s to 40% range, which is really best in class from a consumer packaged goods standpoint. So lower interest expense on debt will certainly be helpful from a cash flow generating perspective.
Now, you mentioned it won't address social equity. It also won't address many serious barriers for companies like onerous taxes and access to the public markets. When might we see these types of reforms? Do you think it'll be included in the coming legislation from Senators Schumer, Wyden, and Booker?
We do. And we think ultimately that piece of legislation looks like a modified version of the States Act, which was a piece of legislation in the last Congress that did have bipartisan sponsorship. We think that that would include the introduction of a federal excise tax, which would allow for the elimination of 280E. That's the very onerous piece of the tax code that prohibits cannabis operators from taking normal operating expense deductions. So they're essentially being taxed on gross profit. As well, we do think it would address social equity, safe banking, so access to commercial banking and insurance, as well as provide an opportunity for these U.S. operators to list onto the major U.S. exchanges.
Now, if there is a little appetite for something like safe banking, do you think that this bill from Senators Schumer, Wyden, and Booker could actually get traction in the Senate and House enough to pass into law?
It's going to require a very delicate balance between some of the policy initiatives that I just outlined, contrasted with social equity. That's going to clearly be an important consideration for Senate Democrats. But the more social equity policy you put into the legislation, the harder it could be to find 10 Republicans. One workaround would be to take all the social equity components of a potential cannabis bill and put them into a voting rights bill or as an amendment to voting rights. That seems to be one piece of legislation, voting rights, where the Democrats might have an appetite to eliminate the filibuster. And then that would leave you with a very clean cannabis bill with social equity already having been separately addressed. And then we do think you could find 10 Republicans for that.
Now, one other issue that these senators did mention when they put out an extensive video about this bill back in mid-March was preventing monopolies by big companies like tobacco companies and alcohol companies. Now, we have seen a number of big tobacco companies investing in cannabis or joining together to lobby, but lawmakers and advocates are resisting based on concerns that cannabis could become tobacco 2.0. Do you think that those concerns are valid?
I don't. We do have big tobacco now, but it took over 100 years to get there. It's been, essentially a century of consolidation to get to, three large operators in the U.S. tobacco landscape: Altria, British American Tobacco, and Imperial. So the market remains incredibly fragmented. By our math, we think that the market share leader in U.S. cannabis maybe has a 5% market share, and that doesn't even include the illicit market.
Do you think that we'll continue to see, more investments from big tobacco into the cannabis industry, especially considering the Biden administration is thinking about cutting nicotine levels in cigarettes?
So all the big three have already made their active bets, at least in the Canadian market. So Altria has made an investment in Kronos, British American Tobacco, and Organigram, and Imperial Brands and Oxley. So I think really the next step is to see, how those Canadian licensed producer partners would approach an opportunity to enter the United States, and whether the U.S. tobacco companies would augment that existing investment with incremental capital.
Now we're running out of time here. I do want to ask you one last quick question, which is that we have seen voters in 5 states, including New Jersey, pass legalization, and then a domino effect with other states, including New York, to legalize this year. What, in your opinion, states are next and when?
We think Connecticut and Rhode Island remain for 2021, and then possibly Pennsylvania next year.
Vivien, thank you so much for joining us again. That is Vivien Azer, Managing Director and Senior Research Analyst at Cowen.